Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this special conversation with Professor Adam Zeman, author of The Shape of Things Unseen, A New Science of Imagination. Adam and I have a unique history together. In 2015, I became one of the original 21 cases in Adam's groundbreaking research on aphantasia. That research changed my life. Today, we have the privilege of exploring Adam's new book, which examines imagination in all its forms, from everyday daydreams to the creative leaps that define human achievement, to the brain networks that make it all possible. The book also delves into conditions where imagination goes awry and the remarkable variations in how different people experience mental imagery, from those of us with aphantasia to individuals with hyperphantasia that experience imagery as vivid as real seeing. Adam, it's wonderful to reconnect with you today.
Hi, very good to see you, Tom.
Well, Adam, when we first met, I don't think we could have imagined the journey that would have followed, the tens of thousands of people that your work would have touched.
No, absolutely not.
So, I mean, maybe let's start there. So, what do you think? What's been the most surprising thing that maybe has come out of the work that started back, was it in like 2014?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it started in a way before that for me because I first encountered somebody who'd lost the ability to imagine back about 20 years ago, in the early 2000s. Became very interested in his case. Wrote a case history describing him, and really didn't expect that work to go very much further. But as you know, it was picked up by Carl Zimmer, who wrote an article about it in Discover magazine, which I think was probably where you encountered our work. And people then began getting in touch saying, I'm just like this person who lost the ability to imagine, except that I've never had it. I've always recognized that there's something slightly different about me in this respect. And then in 2015, we coined the term aphantasia. And I guess if I was to identify one single moment of astonishment, it was when I came back to my hotel room after doing 2 or 3 minutes on breakfast television about this, and emails were coming in every second. So I was just astonished by the number of people with whom this seemed to resonate, and who were glad to have most of them a term to describe a variation in experience which they'd long recognized but hadn't previously been able to name or think about or talk to others about in a straightforward way.
Were you surprised by the amount of people that this resonated with? Like, did you expect this kind of?
No, not at all. So I was delighted when 20 people got in touch over the course of several years. So I thought this was going to be a rarity, a kind of intriguing rarity. I hadn't at all expected that it would be a feature of experience which occurs in a few percent of the world's population.
Yeah, way more common. And even so, when we first did some of our work together, and that 2015, we that first New York Times article came out. Just like you, I had people from all around the world reach out. Also kind of identifying with it. So I think, the level that people kind of identify with this experience, that aha moment, people, this work has ignited in people, I think is. Really great to see.
I suppose it's an invisible difference, isn't it? But it's a difference that goes quite deep. It makes quite a big difference to people's inner lives, to their experience. Sorry, I interrupted you.
It's part of that conscious, that everyday kind of conscious life that you live internally that we don't often talk about. Maybe let's start with the book. So how did you get from So maybe how did this work influence the writing of the book, and maybe talk about that kind of journey, and from a high level, what is the book about?
Yeah, so it's about imagination very broadly, and I guess that in a way the book has origins which are separate to those of the aphantasia work, but the two streams of work interconnected. They flowed into one another in a way. So I've always been very interested in vision and in the neurology of vision. I mean, it's probably the best worked out of the senses. We know a great deal about what happens in the brain when we see, and I was very fascinated by that as a student. So I had a long-standing interest in the neurology of vision, which I think was why part of the reason that aphantasia fascinated me so much, because visualization is a kind of echo of vision in the brain. So that was one long-standing interest. Another long-standing interest is in what makes us special. What is different about the human mind from any other minds on Earth, if there is a difference. And I've thought for a long while, and I'm not the only one, the only person to think this, that imagination is quite a strong candidate. Imagination in the sense of the capacity that allows us to detach ourselves from the here and now, recollect the past, anticipate the future, enter the virtual worlds created by a novelist or a filmmaker or indeed a scientist. And in fact, we spend a great deal of our lives, most of us, in our heads, I think, thinking about things other than the here and now. So I was interested in imagination as a kind of defining human capacity. So I think it was because of those two background interests in vision on the one hand and in imagination as a defining human capacity in the other that I was so intrigued when I met MX 20 years ago, someone who'd lost the, well, as the referral letter put it, lost the ability to imagine. I don't now think that's quite the right way to put it. He'd lost the ability to visualize, but visualization is an interesting, important element of the broader capacity to imagine. And the book really is about imagination broadly, but as you will have seen, Aphantasia gets a reasonable look in.
So, I mean, maybe that's a good place to dive in. What is the difference between imagination and visualization? How do these two attributes kind of live together?
Yeah. Well, so I think there are at least three senses of image and imagine and imagination. There's one which is rather technical, but does still get used. So you might speak of the retinal image, or the image that you form of the world around you. So that's your immediate perceptual experience. So that's one sense. Then there's a more colloquial sense in which we speak about imagining when you're thinking about something that isn't present. So if you think about an apple in its absence, you are imagining it, and for most people that involves visualization. So there's the kind of image of the world as it is present to you at this moment. There's your imagination of things which are not present, and then there's a third sense which has to do with creativity, has to do with reconceiving the world. And it's interesting that we use the term imagine to speak of that kind of reconceiving, reconfiguring, because it doesn't always involve imagery. And we have many good examples now of people with aphantasia who are highly imaginative, highly creative, and imaginative in that third sense. But clearly, language suggests that for most people there is some link between our ability to think about things in their absence and our ability to reconceive, reconfigure them. And for many people, that kind of the creativity involved in that reconceiving and reconfiguring involves imagery. But I think the example of Aphantasia makes it clear that it doesn't have to.
Yeah, that creativity, obviously, the visualization, the images. I mean, the root word of imagine is image, so there's some kind of like strange language things going on. But we have seen many cases of very creative people that don't have those images. So the images aren't the source of the creativity. I think Aphantasia shows us this.
I think that's absolutely right. So creativity is simply the ability to make things that are new and useful in some way. And many creative people describe using imagery in their creative process, in their creative work, but it's clear that that's not required. It's not the only route. So I think it is it's a medium which is used by many creative people, but not by all.
How you talk a little bit about this in the book, some creatives that you've maybe met along the way. How does the creative process that maybe you've witnessed differ between those with aphantasia and those who have vivid visual imagery?
Yeah. So it probably differs a bit depending on the medium. I think perhaps for people with aphantasia, it's a little more mysterious than it is for people with imagery. So many people with imagery describe the occurrence of images during their creative process. So, for example, Philip Pullman, the children's novelist, says that often his work will begin with a kind of glimpse of an intriguing image, which he knows has a certain power. He has a sense of possibility when he glimpses this. And actually, he says he doesn't focus on it too much. He kind of lets it be for a while because he knows that it's a shadow, and you don't want to shine a light on a shadow. And actually, many novelists describe a potent image at the source of much of their work. And people working in other fields also describe the importance of imagery. So Einstein, for example, said that imagery was very important to him in his thinking. He said he didn't use words at all until a very late stage of the process. So clearly, at least from the perspective of the creative person, imagery is often important and somehow facilitates creativity. But we have great examples of highly creative people with aphantasia. So Ed Catmull is a particularly conspicuous one, the past president of Pixar, who won the Turing Prize for his discoveries in computer animation. And when I asked him how his insights, his discoveries arrived, he more or less said, I don't know. I need a whiteboard, and I kind of enter into dialogue with it, and interesting things happen. He was very intrigued to discover that one of his animators, Glen Keane, who was involved in producing the images for The Little Mermaid, was also aphantasic, and apparently Glen had arguments with his mentors who said, "You must be able to see things in your head. How can you draw otherwise?" But he insists that he doesn't, but he draws very well, and again he doesn't have a preconceived notion of the image that's going to appear on the page. He kind of works with the page. The page is his mind's eye. So I think there are clearly some differences in process between creative people with aphantasia and creative people with imagery. But I suspect that we should learn from the creative people with aphantasia that much is mysterious about the creative process. And clearly, I think, this lesson came home to me increasingly as I read around in my research for the book. I think much of the process that leads to creativity occurs unconsciously. Perhaps that shouldn't be a surprise, but I think unconscious processes are hugely important. At the kind of start of my writing career, I wrote a book about consciousness, which I felt was the most interesting topic at the time. In a way, I now feel that unconsciousness is even more interesting.
These are very good examples. If anyone's ever seen, there's a video I think on our Facebook of Glen Keane actually doing his animations, and the level of expression in his face and his body language as he's drawing really shows you, that there are other ways to experience, to know,
yes.
Other than just seeing it in picture form, right? It can be expressed physically and other ways.
It's a lovely video, isn't it? It's hard to know. Two things may be happening, but it's hard to know to what extent he's trying to kind of inhabit the expressions that he's drawing, and to what extent he's being surprised by what he's seeing on the page. There seems to be a bit of both, doesn't it?
Could be a little bit of both. So in the book, Adam, you write, in some of its manifestations, imagination is our most distinctive human capacity. So this maybe just to kind of loop back on your earlier point and interest in imagination. Why is imagination the most distinctive human quality?
Gosh, that's a big question. First of all, I suppose I should make the case that it is, and one bit of evidence that speaks to this is from what's called descriptive experience sampling. So if you probe people at random intervals and ask them what's in their mind, it turns out that actually the most common conscious content for most of us is imagery. More common even than our awareness of the immediate perceptual world. Similarly, people spend between a quarter and a half of their time daydreaming or mind wandering, often daydreaming. So we're very often in our heads, occupied with our thoughts, and thoughts for most people are very often imagistic. And if you just think about the way you spend your day, you'll have had a conversation at some point today already, I suspect, about something that happened in the past, something that may be happening in the future. You might have gone to bed last night reading a novel or watched a film. It's very likely that your day-to-day work takes you away from the here and now, detaches you. There are exceptions, of course, but for most of us, life is lived substantially in the mind. As Robin Dunbar, the anthropologist, said, what sets us apart is our life in the mind, the capacity to imagine. So I think it's a fact. Why is it so important for us? Well, there's a number of answers to that question, but one of them I think has to do with the importance of culture in our lives. So we are profoundly cultural creatures. Maybe we can go on to discuss the various senses in which that's true. But if you um, just you might think of leaving the house, you'll be dressed in clothes, you'll be carrying a wallet which will have credit cards and other cards in it, you'll be wearing a watch, you'll be carrying a pen, all those are all cultural artifacts with a long cultural history, and they are kind of indispensable. We couldn't live our lives without those things. And culture is the product of ultimately individual acts of human imagination. It's because people have been able to detach themselves from the here and now and conceive novelty that culture exists. Culture is, if you like, the accumulation of novel ideas, novel creations. So we spend a great deal of our time detached from the here and now, and our cultural lives depends on that capacity, because that is really what allows creativity to operate.
How do you even in the definition though there of imagination, we talked about how so much of the internal lives is imagistic, and you also write how we are all inveterate namers and explainers, curious, ingenious, eager to analyze and comprehend ourselves and our surroundings.
Yeah.
Lots of that, I'm sure, happens internally. How might living a life without images in the mind impact how we make sense of that world around us, how we live that, in that cultural environment?
Yeah. Well, so I think in important ways, but maybe one should qualify that. I mean, this raises important questions about the nature of aphantasia, really, doesn't it? Which I think are beginning to be answered. So I don't think people with aphantasia are that different to people with imagery. I mean, there are important differences, but I think there are also important commonalities. And so just thinking of the kind of visual functioning of somebody with aphantasia, people with aphantasia on the whole can recognize things just fine. And that tells you that they know what things look like, and they tend to be able to give reasonably good descriptions of the appearances of things. And I forget, Tom, whether this is true of you specifically, but people with aphantasia very often dream visually. So there's a kind of imagistic mental life at night, even if not by day. And there's been really interesting brain imaging work over the last couple of years on aphantasia, which again suggests that there are differences between the brains of people with aphantasia and the brains of people with imagery, but they're subtle. They're not massive. So it's not as if people with aphantasia don't have in their brains representations of the visual world. They do, and I think they're probably quite important to the functioning of those folk. They just aren't, for some reason, those representations don't give rise to the same kind of imagistic visual experience that most of us have. So I think while aphantasia makes a big difference to people's inner lives, and clearly there are underlying biological reasons for that, I think there's still quite a bit in common, and it may well be that people with aphantasia can draw on those imagistic representations in the brain in their thinking, even without experiencing imagery. But having said that, clearly there's a difference, and I don't know whether this will turn out to be replicated by subsequent research, but I was very intrigued by our initial finding that aphantasia nudges people towards STEM, because that made intuitive sense. That if you don't think in imagistic ways, you might be a little bit more likely to think in more abstract terms, and maybe those could be helpful if you're a mathematician or a scientist or working in IT. So I hope that finding does turn out to be correct, because it was appealing. It made intuitive sense, and some people have said that to me very explicitly. So Craig Venter, the geneticist, first person to decode the human genome, got in touch fairly early on and said, "I've always known that this is the case, that I like imagery, and I've also attributed my scientific prowess to it because my mind isn't cluttered by the images that seem to bug everyone else."
Well,
So
yeah, there's
yeah,
I mean, there's something called the visual impedance effect,
yeah,
where sometimes the visual details are actually not central to maybe the core problems that are being worked
yeah,
on. So
yeah,
it's not like mental imagery is always just upside. I think that's actually one of the things that took me a long time to come to terms with as someone who never experienced mental imagery. I think it's very easy to romanticize the idea of it.
yeah,
How lovely it would be to see images, of the future, of your past, and to do that mental time travel. It's
yeah.
there's a very romantic element to it, but it is a little bit of a double-edged sword in some circumstances, isn't it?
It certainly is. And yes, this touches on something that I discuss in that first chapter in the book. I think the chapter you were quoting from a moment ago. I mean, we are inveterate explainers. We're detached from the here and now, but often that that bothers us. We want to get closer to the here and now, and so quite a lot of human life involves trying to be more present, trying to rediscover the child's vivid appreciation of the moment, of the world in all its sort of beauty and freshness. And imagery can have the opposite effect. It can take you away from that. And clearly, while people can greatly enjoy recollecting the past and contemplating the future, they can also be plagued by regrets and distressing images from the past and fears for the future. So yes, imagination is it's Janus faced. I do think it's a defining human capacity, but it can also be a curse under some circumstances. And for most of us, imagery is an important element in that imaginative life.
How do we know how much of the imagery experience is voluntary versus involuntary?
Yeah, I would suspect that in an average day for most of us, those of us with imagery, the bulk of it is going to be involuntary. So imagery tends to be studied by psychologists in experiments in which they say, imagine an apple or imagine the Eiffel Tower, and that's a very artificial paradigm, isn't it? So that's not something that you have to do very often. People with imagery can, if they're kind of pressed, but I don't think it's the typical case. So more often, I think somebody will be experiencing imagery when they're daydreaming or anticipating something that may be happening later in the day, and an image just comes into their head. They're reading a novel and they enter a visual world. That's something that's come up again and again in discussions with people with aphantasia, who say, when I go to the cinema and see the film of a book, I never have the problem that the hero doesn't look the way I I thought he or she should. Yeah. So I think much of our imagery is involuntary rather than voluntary.
That's definitely, and just for the audience listening, I mean, personally, that's one that took me a long time to understand, because I think when you hear that other people are seeing pictures in your head and you don't experience it, the kind of closest reference, and many people have emailed me about this, it's like kind of like a computer screen. You can move stuff around and you have like full control of it. But I don't think that's the actual experience.
Yeah, not typically. People sometimes do that. You might want to decide whether a bit of furniture is going to fit into a particular room, and then you'll make a deliberate effort to visualize the room and the other things in it, and do some mental rotation and so on. But I think that's not the typical case. People on the whole are not spending their days doing that unless they're designers or surveyors.
I guess the analogy would be, for the involuntary part, it'd be like, lots of kind of stuff just coming up on the computer screen without your control. I think that like involuntary part is hard to wrap your head around as a non-visualizer, because it's, I don't know, it's just like it's very foreign.
So I think that probably varies a lot between people. I think that's going to be a dimension of variation within visualizers. There'll be some who have lots happening in their heads, some of it out of their control, and some of it perhaps distressing them. Whereas other people with imagery will have relatively quiet visual minds.
How I guess, what have we learned about the underlying structures in the brain that cause aphantasia? So there's, I mean, in the book, you write a lot about the default mode network and its relationship to imagination. So maybe we could talk a little bit about that, and then use that to talk a little bit maybe about what we know that's
Yeah.
different about the aphantasic brain?
Sure. So default mode network, this is really very interesting, and probably I should start from scratch because it may this is not going to be familiar, I suspect,
Sure, yeah.
to quite a few people listening. So most work, brain imaging work, functional brain imaging work, looking at what happens in the brain when people are thinking in various ways, involves giving people tasks. So you might get somebody to do some mental arithmetic, and you do a brain imaging study in which you compare what's happening in the brain when they're doing mental arithmetic with what's happening when they're maybe at rest or perhaps doing some other task, perhaps involving words rather than numbers. And the underlying principle of all the brain imaging techniques is that brain is a bit like muscle. If you use a bit of brain, the blood flow to it increases, and you can use these techniques to see that. So if you're looking at the world, you're going to be using the back of your brain, which has the primary visual cortex. Blood flow will increase there, and you can visualize that using brain imaging techniques. So most work up till about 20 years ago involved giving people tasks and then seeing what happened. But about 20 years ago, people began looking at what happens in a resting brain. And this turned out to be really fascinating. So if you perform a brain imaging technique, it's usually functional magnetic resonance imaging, while someone is simply chilling, resting in the scanner. It turns out that you can see all the networks that are present in an active behaving brain. So, for example, activity in the motor cortex, the part of the brain that controls movement, on one side of the brain will be talking to the motor cortex on the other side of the brain and talking to other regions that are involved in controlling movement towards the front of the brain. So you can pick out a network where activity is co-varying and where it has to do with movement. You could do the same for vision, and there'd be a network of visual areas in which all the areas will be talking to one another, having a kind of peaceful conversation while you're just resting in the scanner. Similarly for areas to do with hearing. A fascinating discovery was that there's a set of regions which is particularly active in the resting brain, so it sort of stands out above the background. And this network, which had, you might have predicted this from previous work, but still, this came as something of a surprise. This network, which involves areas in the medial temporal lobe, which has particularly to do with memory, and areas on the inner surface of the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe. This network really has to do with daydreaming. So it is particularly active if you think about the past, anticipate the future, think about other minds. So think about yourself in relation to other people, think about moral decisions, very much the kinds of things we would do, I think, if we were just resting, waiting for something to happen. You'd think about something that happened yesterday, something you planned for tomorrow, the last time someone offended you, some difficult decision you have to take. So the default mode network is so called because it is the network of regions which is active by default, especially active in a resting brain, and it seems rather extraordinarily to have functions which map on, in a sense, to imagination. Now, that doesn't have to be visual. In fact, the visual regions aren't part of the default mode network, but it can interact with them. So that's the story of the default mode network, and it probably does have a relationship to creativity as well as imagination. So there's an interesting relationship between the default mode network and what's called the executive network or cognitive control network. So there are regions which tend to be in the frontal lobe and parietal lobes on the outer surface of the brain, which really have to do with decision making and controlling your behavior. And on the whole, default mode network and executive network are opposed to one another. So when the default mode network is particularly active, the control network will be less active, and vice versa. And you actually can see an oscillation between them in the resting brain to some degree. It seems that in creative people, while they are involved in their creative work, these two sets of regions collaborate to an unusual degree, which makes intuitive sense, doesn't it? Because when you're in a creative state, you have to reach deep down inside yourself to pull out those creative ideas, but you also have to be able to shape them and to some extent subject them to criticism as you're working with them. So there's evidence that there's an interesting relationship between these two sets of regions in creative brains and in the process of creativity. So that's the default mode network. What about imagery? I think I'm going to need a sip of tea to tell you about
yes,
imagery.
no problem.
So let's think specifically about imagery. We can come back to the default mode network and how that relates. If you're asked to imagine something, as in a psychological experiment, when a psychologist says, imagine an apple, quite a few things are going to happen in the brain. You'll have to understand the instructions, so you'll have to use language. You'll have to remember what an apple looks like, so that will involve consulting memory, wherever that lives in the brain. And then what seems to happen in people with imagery is that your knowledge of what an apple looks like is then used to drive the visual system in reverse, so to speak. So when you're looking at things, information streams in from the eyes and gets fed back to the visual cortex and then through the visual system in the brain. So it's kind of bottom-up process primarily. When you're imagining, that process is reversed. So you remember what something looks like, and you use your knowledge of what it looks like to drive the visual system top down. But there's good evidence that the process of visualization does indeed involve visual regions. So activating visual regions is key, presumably to giving imagery its visual feel. There's a lot of argument about whether all the visual areas are involved in visualization, and it seems to vary from task to task and maybe possibly from person to person, but certainly some of them are. And when you're visualizing, you're adopting a kind of introspective mental frame. So you would expect the default mode network to be somewhat more active than otherwise, because your thought is internally rather than externally directed. So that's what happens in a visualizing brain in a person who can visualize. What's different in the brains of people with aphantasia? So this is very much work in progress still. In our original patient MX, who had lost the ability to visualize, we had a nice correlate for the change he described in his experience. So when he looked at famous faces, he had normal brain activation, including activation in parts of the occipital and temporal lobes, which are involved in recognizing faces. But when he tried to visualize them, he underactivated those regions. So he failed to activate his visual brain normally when he was visualizing. So we thought this was perhaps helped to explain the change he described in his experience. Fast forwarding to the work of the last few years, and this work really is quite hot off the press. We did a study early on, I think the first brain imaging study in aphantasia, which had a nice finding in relation to the resting brain. So it seems that people with very vivid imagery have stronger connections between the front of the brain and the visual system than people with aphantasia at rest. So that's intuitively appealing, because in people with aphantasia, thoughts seem to translate very readily into imagery, whereas in people with aphantasia, they don't. And perhaps that could be explained by stronger connectivity between, if you like, thinking regions and seeing regions in people with hyperphantasia. We didn't find the kind of difference you might have predicted from the MX study. So we didn't find that when people with aphantasia try to visualize, they have very different activity in their visual system to people with hyperphantasia. So that was a bit of a puzzle. Suggests that the differences in brain activity in aphantasia may be more subtle than you might have thought at first. We did find a difference in relation to the parietal lobes, which seem to be more strongly activated in people with vivid imagery when they visualize than in people with aphantasia. But we didn't find a difference in the visual system itself. And then moving to a very, very recent study, not from my lab, but from Yang Hao Liu and Paolo Bartolomeo in Paris, they found something that rather nicely tallies with what we discovered. They, like us, they find that when people with aphantasia think about how things look, they do activate the visual cortex. If you're thinking about what somebody's face looks like, you might well activate face sensitive regions in your visual system. But there is an area which seems to play a particularly important part in visualization in the temporal lobe, in the visual cortices, which doesn't connect to the front of the brain as it would do in somebody with imagery. So again, a difference in connectivity is showing up. And I think that's probably the strongest candidate for the difference between aphantasic and typical or hyperphantasic brains, differences in connectivity, strength between regions at the front of the brain and regions involved in vision towards the back of the brain.
Really interesting that the visual areas are still active, and that helps maybe explain why, those who can't visualize can still understand visual questions, visual cues, answer, lots of visual details.
Why they can understand,
not a conscious experience.
Why they can understand, why they can dream visually also. And I don't know whether this resonates with you, but many people with aphantasia have said to me, I feel that there's imagery there. It's just sort of over the hill. I can't quite get to it, but I almost can. It's rather like a tip of the tongue experience.
Yeah, it's like because there's lots of I think of the apple. It's like, there's lots of, I know all the it's there's a difference with language. It's not like, there's the thing like a picture is worth 1,000 words. But words take time to say. So it's not like I'm in my mind like saying, okay, red apple has this kind of shape. It's like, no, I know all of those details before I've articulated them.
Yeah.
So the information is there, not in language form, just also not in visual form. So I think that is that feeling of it's like it's almost there.
Yeah, and this kind of helps to make sense of the fact that aphantasia is not at all disabling. You might, if you knew nothing about aphantasia and you were told that there were people who can't form images, you might think that that it's really going to be really hard for them to think. Aristotle said the mind never thinks without a phantasm. He clearly thought that imagery was sort of fundamental. So it helps in understanding why people with aphantasia do just fine. I think it probably helps to know that those visual representations are present, even if not doing quite the same job that they do in people with imagery.
Do we see a difference between those with acquired aphantasia, maybe like MX? So they kind of grew up visualizing, and then for some reason, some kind of trauma, the brain stops visualizing.
Yeah, I think that probably is going to turn out to be different, and I'm dying to properly study the group of over 100 or so folk with acquired aphantasia who've been in touch now, because I think that should be very revealing. Previous work suggests that the lesion, the area that's dysfunctioning in people who once had imagery but have lost it, is roughly in the left temporal lobe, which is interesting because that's, of course, language is on the left side of the brain, and I think imagery it's in a sort of middle ground between language and vision. So most people who it's sort of somewhere between a thought and a thing, if you like. So for most people with imagery, the image of an apple or your front door or your friend's face is not like real seeing, but it's nevertheless it nevertheless has a visual feel, and you access it through language, and language sort of can translate itself into a visual medium, but only up to a point. So it's interesting that the left hemisphere and the left temporal lobe in particular, which is very important in language, seems to be a key region.
Very, very interesting. Let's shift gears here a little bit. I want to talk kind of about the relationship between imagery and memory. Many people describe the mental imagery experience as like a mental time travel. That includes time travel into the past to re-experience those kind of memories. How do people with aphantasia experience memories different? What do we know about that so far?
Yeah, so I think that's the biggest difference subjectively and in neuropsychological terms between people with aphantasia and people with imagery. So not everybody, and it's interesting to ask why not everybody, but most people with aphantasia say that they feel their memory for their personal past is a bit thinner, a bit less rich than the memory of their close friends and relations. And that has now been borne out by a number of studies in which psychologists have measured the amount of detail that people with aphantasia can supply when they are recollecting past memories. And there tends to be less detail, particularly less sensory detail, and the same interestingly applies to imagining future events, because there's quite a close relationship between remembering the past and anticipating the future. Memory in it probably exists, doesn't it, to help guide action as it moves into the future, rather than just for the pleasure of recollecting the past. Memory generally isn't much affected in people with aphantasia. So people with aphantasia are perfectly good at doing working memory tasks where you're just asked to hold some information in your mind and then use it in some way a few seconds down the tracks. That's not affected at all. And visual memory of the kind that psychologists typically measure, where you're asked to look at a picture and then describe it half an hour down the line, that's not much affected either. So it seems to be only memory for these relatively remote, personally significant events that's affected. And it's very interesting to ask why. There is some work actually by a Canadian psychologist, or from the lab of a Canadian psychologist, Brian Levine, which is probably quite relevant here. So he and his team have shown that there seem to be two kinds of rememberers where these past personally significant memories are concerned. There are people who remember in more sensory terms, particularly more visual terms, and there are people who remember in more verbal terms. They'll kind of remember the facts, but not the feelings, if you like. And that may map onto the distinction here. I suspect that people with aphantasia tend to remember the facts more. It's more difficult for them to access the feelings. One possible explanation might be that if you have imagery, that's a kind of marker for replay involving the visual system. So we know that memories, after they're formed, get replayed unconsciously in the brain. And I suspect that in people with imagery, the replay goes back into the visual system, whereas if you lack imagery, it probably goes forwards, if you like, into those areas which have to do with thought rather than sensation.
Yeah.
So I think that's the biggest single neuropsychological difference.
Yeah, and that resonates with me. That's how I would describe my own memories. I actually have lots of memories, but they're facts. It's like the way I like to describe it, it's kind of like a trivia. It's like the same way I know the earth goes around the sun. I know that, these events happened to me in my past. I can, with a little bit of effort, put them into an order, into a sequence, bring out lots of kind of details about them. But they're just, facts about my life.
So psychologists draw a distinction between what they call personal semantic memories and personal episodic memories. And your semantic memory is your sort of database of facts, really, knowledge about the world, knowledge about language, but it's essentially factual knowledge, whereas your episodic memory has to do with the ability to re-experience things from the past. And I think people with aphantasia tend to have a semantic rather than an episodic kind of recall for their personal past.
I wonder if this is different for folks who have maybe no visual imagery, but lots of imagery in some of the other senses. Maybe the memories can kind of come through, and we can maybe transition to that topic. So I have no imagery in any of the senses, but I've spoken to many who maybe don't have visuals, but they still have lots of auditory or lots of motor imagery, and they can describe feeling their body being in a room, or hearing the sound of an environment, and that helps kind of anchor in memories in a different way.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was corresponding with a colleague friend a while ago who said that he was puzzled by the kind of emphasis on imagery, visual imagery, in these conversations, because for him it's always been the feel of an event that that's important, and that he can recollect and re-inhabit, and feel is a nice sort of ambiguous term which can embrace many senses, including vision. So you're right, of course. When we first coined the term aphantasia, we'd been thinking in visual terms. What people were describing to us was a lack of visual imagery, but then it turned out that actually at least half, and I suspect rather more than half, the majority of people with aphantasia seem to have thin or absent imagery in all the senses. But there are exceptions to that. There do seem to be people who have purely visual aphantasia or purely auditory aphantasia, and people who have, for example, visual aphantasia, but a very active mind's ear. And I agree that could well be relevant to the variation in people's ability to remember their personal past. I mean, I was going to say exceptions to the rule are always interesting and informative, and there are people with aphantasia who say, I don't know, my memory is fine. I'm the person everyone comes to in the family when they need to be reminded about something. So there clearly are exceptions, and it would be very interesting to know more about them.
Yeah, absolutely. And as what I like to talk about when I meet with people who are just discovering they have aphantasia is like, not everyone, aphantasia, mental imagery, let's say, even in all of the different senses, are just one set of the attributes that kind of make you who you are. So there are lots of other kind of factors at play, which is why we see such a diversity of experiences.
I absolutely agree. It's one small piece in the great jigsaw of our psychology, isn't there?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I remember somebody getting in touch early on saying, now I understand why I failed that exam when I was in school.
yeah, exactly. But I don't think so. Yeah, there's a member in the community who often brings up the idea of the aphantasia stamp. People have this tendency when they discover they have aphantasia to kind of stamp it, look back at their life and use the stamp and say, oh, that's because of aphantasia, and that's because of aphantasia. So people do have to be cautious at and also the other thing, I think a big thing with this, I mean, just in life in general, but especially as it relates to aphantasia, is belief can be a self-fulfilling prophecy. So we also get lots of people who say, "Oh, I can't be creative because of the aphantasia." But if that's what you believe, if that's what you're looking for, it's very clearly not in and of itself the thing that's going to prevent you, from being an artist or from doing really whatever career or passion that you have, because we see successful aphantasics in every walk of life.
We do. Yeah, absolutely.
There's an ongoing debate, or at least a differing of opinion, relating to aphantasia and PTSD. We've even hosted some different kind of talks about this recently. Does imagery impact the ability to experience PTSD, the intensity of the PTSD, and the symptoms? Where do you come? What do you think about this?
So again, I'm sorry to give this answer so often, but this is very much work in progress. I think we don't really know the answer to that question properly yet, because clearly there are people with aphantasia who have PTSD. There's no doubt about that. So it doesn't prevent it from occurring, but you might predict that it would slightly reduce the likelihood that you develop PTSD. So many people have said that they move on more easily from traumatic events than others seem to, because they're not revisited by the thoughts of the person they've lost, or the place that they've left, or the person they've broken up with. And there's now one experimental study showing that if you play distressing video clips to people with aphantasia, they are less troubled by recurring thoughts about it, and of course recurring images of it over the weeks to come. So I think it would be a reasonable hypothesis that aphantasia is somewhat protective, and would reduce the likelihood of PTSD. But we don't. That so far as I know, that hasn't been proven yet. It's I hope there may be an opportunity by working with a big biobank, which has clinical follow-up data to establish whether or not that's the case.
Yeah, really interesting, especially in the kind of looping back to that earlier piece around the involuntary imagery. I've had people email me, saying that they have trouble falling asleep at night because they have these flashes of these pictures
Yeah, yeah,
that kind of haunt them, and I don't think you get at least that same intensity of, at least not visual flashbacks. And there's that whole idea of the,
yeah,
again, the picture's worth 1,000 words. It has images in and of themselves have lots of can potentially have lots of meaning and weight
yeah.
to them,
They've
more
been
than
described as
thoughtful
emotional
words.
amplifiers, haven't they? Which
Yeah,
is a nice
exactly.
term. And actually, when we were talking about this earlier, I didn't make it clear. I think initially we thought of aphantasia as a condition affecting voluntary imagery. I think it's become clear that it affects voluntary and involuntary imagery during the day. Dreaming's different, and hypnagogia is interesting. So many people with aphantasia, as they're drifting off to sleep, will have images.
Yeah.
Again, suggesting that they're kind of quite close to being able to do it in
It's
wakefulness, but
not there.
there's
And
some obstacle.
hypnopopia, which I think is waking up in
Yep,
the morning. It's just
yep,
in between
yep,
those kind of
yep.
dream states.
And the other footnote, if I may, to the PTSD question is that quite a number of people have said that they think they might have lost imagery following a traumatic event. So that's another interesting possibility, that it seems plausible that if something very distressing happens, you might, in the effort not to think about it, re-experience it, you might dial down your imagery.
Yeah, almost as a defense mechanism to
Yep,
reduce that emotional
yep,
amplification.
yep.
Going back to the kind of broader concept of imagination, you talk a little bit in the book about imagination. Let me see if I can find it. Just give me a second. Yeah, about imagination evolving for specific adaptive purposes. So this is maybe it's kind of slightly related. Why do you think, how has imagination been in kind of evolutionary pressure, and is mental imagery involved, you think, in that kind of evolutionary path? Why would we
Yeah,
evolve to
yeah,
visualize?
yeah. So I suspect that imagery is present in animals. So we know that animals obviously represent the world in their heads. They can recognize things. We also know that they dream. We know that they engage in replay. So like us, if they have an experience, it'll be replayed in the brain, unconsciously most of the time, probably. So they probably have the makings, the neural makings of imagery, if you like. What I suspect distinguishes us from other animals is that we have evolved to share what we imagine. And I think you can see the last 3 million years of evolution in those terms. We're ultra social, highly collaborative creatures who are very accomplished mind sharers. I think that mind sharing actually precedes language and makes it possible. So if part of a chapter in the book is devoted to child development, and there's that really fascinating development over the course of the first year of life, which enables children to begin to use very early language. But right at the start of that process, they engage in extraordinarily sort of intimate dialogues with their carers, usually with their mothers, at the age just of 2 or 3 months, which enable them to share attention. And then once you are good at sharing attention with someone else, you can begin to direct that attention on things in the world. And then it's not too big a step to begin to refer to those things using gestures or using mimes or using words, and then you can begin to share your mind in a kind of full-blooded way with the help of language. And that development that occurs over the first year or more of life echoes what has happened over the 3 million years of evolution which separate us from creatures with brains the size of chimps. I think what drove the growth of the brain from 500 to around 1500 mils was the emergence of culture. So it was through creativity that culture took off. Creativity, as we were saying, is the outcome of individual acts of imagination, and these depend on our very powerful brains, and in particular on our capacity to share the contents of our minds with one another. And to take a very topical example of the importance of imagination, many lives were saved during COVID by politicians who were able to imagine what would happen if they didn't take certain measures. And there's a very hard outcome there, measurable outcome related to the capacity to think coherently about the future. And that future thinking is, for most people, to some extent imagistic, but it doesn't have to be.
Is you also write, I guess somewhat related, you also write that imagination is a powerful drug, when discussing the placebo effect. So
yeah,
maybe explain what you mean by that, and then also, do you think aphantasics are affected to the same extent by that?
That's an interesting question, isn't it? So actually, it was a talk on the placebo effect that really kicked off the writing of this book, funnily enough. So a long while ago, 20 years ago, I went to a talk by somebody who'd been working on the placebo effect and who had shown, using a brain imaging technique, that when you take a placebo for pain, your brain releases internal endorphins. So the placebo effect, which sounds as if it depends on imagination, and in a sense it does depend on imagination. You imagine that your pain is going to be reduced by the drug you're being given. That imaginative process has a describable, definable neural basis, and this really, I thought this was really rather extraordinary, and it made me think that maybe Picasso's dictum that everything we can imagine is real, is true. There's a detailed explanation to be given for this, for the power of a placebo agent, and that power is considerable. So I describe a very nice experiment in the book in which people were given an infusion of a pain relieving drug and then subjected to painful stimuli, and they were told that the drug would be switched on at a certain point and then switched off. But in fact, it was left running. And the loss in pain relief when they believed the drug had been switched off, but in fact it was still running, was greater than the effect of the drug. So expectation very powerfully influences our experience. And that's part of a bigger story, that prediction plays a huge part in our experience generally. People, it's been said that we predict the world into being, that experience is more inside out than outside in. Our experience of the world depends on a huge accumulated stock of knowledge and expectation which we're generally unaware of. But that's key to understanding how we perceive the world, whether we are aphantasic or have imagery, I think. The question of whether the placebo effects are as powerful in people with aphantasia as in those with imagery is an interesting one, which I don't think anyone's yet studied, so far as I know.
Well, it does go to that wider kind of point that I brought up earlier, is that like belief is a self-fulfilling prophecy. Your belief on your own aphantasia. Placebo effect kind of plays into that in a way where, if you think that you can do it.
Absolutely. Yeah. So in the book, I discuss that mysterious condition which was once called hysteria and is now called functional disorder, in which people appear to have physical symptoms like paralysis of one side, say, or a seizure, but in fact, there's no underlying basis for their presentation in disease, and it turns out that expectation plays a very important role in understanding that kind of illness, which actually is common.
Good life lessons for folks. I just have maybe one more question, and then we'll transition to some community questions.
Sure.
So if folks do have questions that you'd like to ask Adam, feel free to start adding them to the chat, and we'll get to them in a few minutes. Kind of maybe a bit of a funny or a cheeky question, Adam, but if you were to wake up tomorrow having lots of mental imagery, so you just like wake up and you yourself have aphantasia, how do you think you'd feel about it? And do you think it would change your perspective on any of your work?
Well, it would be very interesting. I suspect that. So I talked to MX a lot about this 20 years ago, and I think I'd probably feel rather like him. I would miss being able to see, as he put it. But I think I'd get on with life. I just like MX. In fact, I often get to sleep by visualizing something I did during the day, often a walk or a jog I went on, and I find that therapeutic, so I'd miss that. I enjoy inhabiting a visual world when I read a novel. In fact, recently I found myself trying to remember where a place was. Like it kept coming into my head, and then I realized it didn't exist. It was a place I'd read about. So I enjoy that kind of experience, but I think I could manage without it. And conversely, I can't remember if I told you this story, but in 2019 we had a conference for people with aphantasia and hyperphantasia, and there was quite a long discussion among the folk with aphantasia about whether they would like to be given imagery, and the fairly clear consensus was that they would, but just for a day.
Yeah, just to try it out.
Try it out, but they were quite happy the way they were.
Yeah. I understand that, because you don't know what the experience is going to be like, and especially if you've had it congenitally, you've had it your whole life. You've developed all your techniques for dealing with the world, without images, and so. What I'm gonna just, before we get to the questions, I'm going to give me 1 second. I'm going to throw the book up on screen for everyone to take a look, and then maybe you could tell me. Hold on. There we go. There's the book. Adam, what do you think, or what do you hope readers, Aphant and not, what do you hope that they take away from reading the book? There's a link in the description below for everyone who's watching now.
Yeah. I hope that they'll enjoy reading it. I enjoyed living with these ideas for a long while. I find them very exciting. I hope that it will give people a sense of the extraordinary power of the brain and its complexity. I've long had a feeling that if we appreciated the complexity of the human organism generally, but the brain in particular, we'd treat each other better. We are the most extraordinary creations, really, and I think the processes which the book describes help to explain how it is that each of us is unique. Sort of embodies a religious insight in a way, doesn't it? He who saves a single life saves the world entire. Each of us inhabits his own imaginative universe, and each of our universes is subtly different to that of anyone else. So an appreciation of the generative power of the human mind, I guess, is what I hope people will discover in the book.
Well, beautiful. I hope everyone watching along here goes and takes a look at the book. Your work has been instrumental. I think it's touched the lives of so many people, and it's a great book. So maybe with that, let's get to some questions. So I'm going to scroll through here. Forgive me, there's lots to go through, and
sure.
Screen. So let's see what I can find. Okay, here Paulina asks, is it possible to detect aphantasia in very young children somehow? I mean, babies or toddlers. Do we know anything about the ability to visualize at this age group?
Well, so I have some small kids, and I've been very much on the lookout for their for evidence of visualization in them, and certainly at a certain point it becomes possible to discuss this with them. It's clearly going to be difficult in babies, so I'm just thinking about the more objective techniques which are being used to recognize aphantasia, and I think it would be difficult to use any of them, wouldn't it, except for brain imaging. So this is sort of science fiction. I'm just thinking aloud. I think in principle, once we understand the neural basis of aphantasia well, it should be possible to detect that in small children, in infants.
Do we know?
Yeah.
Well,
I was just going to say the other techniques tend to rely on verbal instruction, which is going to be problematic in
yeah, you need a level of understanding. Do we know if, like, does visualization kind of start like from young children? Do we have any idea on, like, when do humans start visualizing? Is this something that starts from the beginning?
So I mean, with respect to aphantasia, we've just sort of taken it for granted that it's there from the beginning because that's what people tell us. So they've been that people with aphantasia generally say they've been that way for as long as they can remember. So the assumption is that it has been forever, but we don't know that for sure. Small children certainly talk in ways that suggest they visualize from, I would say, the age of 2 or so. I've seen it said that small children are more vivid visualizers than adults. I'm not sure of the evidence for that. Eidetic imagery, which was the kind of photographic memory phenomenon whereby children can look at something and then continue to see it and often project the image. That curiously, research in eidetic imagery sort of died out. I don't really know why, but the reason I mentioned is that it was said to occur in children, but it very rarely occurs in adults. And again, I'm thinking aloud, the brains of small children are hyperconnected. So we know that synapses, the connections between neurons, proliferate during the first few years of life, and then actually they die back. And if it may be a little bit speculative, but it may be that aphantasia is the result of having a slightly underconnected brain, at least in certain respects. So you might speculate that a hyperconnected brain is going to be a brain with more vivid imagery, and therefore that small children should have it. You can tell from the way I'm sort of freely associating that I don't know the answer here, but there are some thoughts.
Yeah. That's great. Okay, David asks, you ask Adam whether aphantasics have no inner voice or whether they do not correlate.
Right, I have a paper in my inbox which I haven't yet read on exactly this topic. So it's being investigated. My impression, anecdotally, from people who've been in touch, is that it's a mix. Certainly, some people have described having a very active inner voice, and there's been the idea that actually people with aphantasia, or at least some of them, describe things to themselves and use that description as the basis for their recollection. But there are other people who've said that they don't have an inner voice, so I think it's going to be a mixed bag.
Yeah, it's even for me one of those ones where you always say, like, back to Aristotle, thought the mind can't exist without images because he likely saw images. Yeah. I think people have a tendency to have a difficulty understanding what an experience kind of outside of their conscious world would be like, and I'm guilty of it. A life without inner thought, without an inner voice, and without images is a confusing one for me. So for me, actually, it's a good example of that, because I do have inner voice. I do, right. I'm talking to you now with this voice aloud. When I stop speaking, that inner voice is generally running.
Okay.
Not all the time, but most of the time.
I mean, maybe I should give a shout for this technique of descriptive experience sampling, which I think we should use in aphantasia. So this is the technique developed by a psychologist called Russ Hurlburt, which involves trying to catch experience sort of on the wings. So a buzzer sounds and you have to say exactly what's in your mind at that moment, because it's hard, isn't it? when I was writing the book, there is a section on inner speech, and I spent a while trying to work out whether I have it or I don't have it, and it's a hard thing to do. It's hard to introspect, isn't it?
It is, and then it's kind of like that thing. Once then you're thinking about it, you're thinking, your dominant thinking faculties are the ones that take over.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. It's the kind of refrigerator light phenomenon.
Yeah, exactly.
In reverse, I guess. Yes.
Can you talk about the neural correlates of the relationship between spatial memory and aphantasia? Do we know anything?
Yeah, so this is a great question. Actually, I wondered about saying something about that earlier. So, most people, or the majority of people with aphantasia, lack sensory imagery, so visual, auditory, tactile, and so forth. But one of the questions that we included in our original questionnaire, I don't know if you remember this, Tom, has to do with counting the number of windows in your house or your apartment, and most people with aphantasia can do that just fine. And when you ask them how, they say, well, I sort of have an idea, I have a kind of map in my mind, I can inspect the map. It's not a visual experience, but I know where the windows are and I can count them. So that suggests some kind of interesting spatial imagery which is rather devoid of sensory content, but which is nonetheless useful in performing tasks like that. And that echoes a distinction that's been drawn in the neuroscience work on imagery for a long time between object imagery and spatial imagery. And this relates to the fact that in the brain there are two big streams of visual processing. There's one stream that goes from the primary visual cortex down into the temporal lobe, and that has to do with seeing in relatively high detail and in color and recognizing things, and it's sometimes called the what pathway. But then there's a different pathway that goes up into the parietal lobe, which was originally called the where pathway, and which has to do with controlling action under visual guidance. And it may be that spatial imagery involves that pathway, whereas object imagery involves the occipitotemporal pathway, and perhaps in aphantasia, this is the pathway that's not working quite as normal during attempts to visualize, whereas the where pathway or how pathway might be working normally. So, because it turns out that if you measure spatial imagery in people with aphantasia, it's probably normal or even above average.
Yeah, that's a great little tidbit. Okay, Lewis asks, is it possible that the incidence of aphantasia is a much higher percentage of the population, since it's a relatively new investigation and most people I speak to have never thought of it?
I think it's unlikely, just because there have now been some studies which seem to converge on the finding that it's a few percent, depending a bit on where you draw the line. So if you only include people who score right down at 16/80 on the vividness of visual imagery questionnaire, which means that for each of the 16 scenarios, they are just thinking about it, they can't see anything. If you only include people with that score, it's down around 1%. If you're a little bit more generous, it rises up to around 4%. I think there is a bell curve, so there are going to be people who are not in the aphantasic range but have relatively weak imagery. So in that sense, it could be true. But I think the concept will become less useful if it's
the further out,
if the boundary is drawn too high.
Yeah. I agree with that. There's a related question here. I'm going to answer it first, and then I'll share it. Then you can take a stab. Can you also share your thoughts on the VVIQ? Even though it's a validated test, do you think it accurately captures individual differences in mental imagery? I would say I know this to be a fact, that there is a much larger variance in the mental imagery experience than a 1 to 5 kind of rating. I've heard some incredible stories of the types of inner experiences people have. The VVIQ captures one attribute, which is vividness, but if you think of an image, there are so many more attributes that could be present, from movement to projection into the kind of 3D world around them. I think we actually don't know a lot about what that range is on the upper scale, and actually some work that we're kind of interested in and doing at the Aphantasia Network. But Adam, I'll then get your thoughts.
I think you've answered the question very well, Tom. I think it depends on whether you're a sort of glass half full or glass half empty person a little. For my purposes, it's been, I think, a very useful measure. So I think if you score 16, that really means something, and it means that you have a different kind of mind to the mind of somebody who scores 80. So I think at the extremes, it's very helpful. I would agree, at least in marking out groups of people who have interestingly different experience.
Right.
But then there's a huge amount more to learn about them than the VVIQ can capture, and certainly lots of, I think probably the difference between 50 and 55 or 60 and 62, that that's going to be questionable.
So exactly.
But yeah, at the extremes, I think it's particularly helpful.
Jen asks, since there's a strong overlap between aphantasia and SDAM, is there a possibility that one is symptomatic of the other?
Yeah, so just in case people don't know, this is SDAM is the severely deficient autobiographical memory syndrome, again described by Brian Levine's group. So this describes people who, again, are leading entirely normal lives, but have a really very depleted memory for their personal past, reduced, yes, to a kind of set of facts, and not a particularly rich set of facts. So there are some people with aphantasia who fall in the SDAM category, but I would say it's a minority. I'm not really sure whether everyone with SDAM has aphantasia. I know for sure that some do. I would be interested to ask Brian Levine that question. My impression is that these are overlapping circles. I don't think they're identical. I don't think they're the same thing, but there is an interesting overlap between them.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I think it's, just from conversations I've had, I think it makes sense that you could have visual imagery, but also have difficulty with autobiographical memory, and vice versa to be true.
We absolutely. I mean, we know that to be the case from people with amnesia. That's absolutely right. I don't know whether the people who meet the SDAM criteria always have aphantasia or not.
Here's another one from James. Can you comment on the nature of people realizing they are aphantasic late in life? I only discovered I have no visual recall 3 years ago at the age of 67, and comment on how the public is so unaware. I will say, James, that maybe later in life, but not the latest. I think the record that I have is 92, which is very late in life. But Adam, do you have any other thoughts on this?
Yeah, no, yes, no. I've also had contacts from people well on in their lives. Well, I think it reflects a number of things. One is that we all take our own experience to be the norm until something kind of startles us into the realization that we are a bit different in some respects. So just as with aphantasia, people with synesthesia sometimes only realize that they're a bit different well into their lives. So this is the tasting shapes and seeing letters of the alphabet in particular colors. People with synesthesia will often have assumed that everyone is the same until something startles them. We all take ourselves to be the norm. I guess in the case of aphantasia specifically, it was perhaps more difficult to get a handle on this before there was a name for it, before there was a word for it, because it would be hard to describe. It would make it harder to describe capture the difference in your experience if you sort of didn't have a flag to fly under, so to speak.
And the VVIQ was, I think, in the 70s. I also think, correct me if you disagree, Adam, but there's also this tendency of like something with the VVIQ, everyone's just answering 111 all the way down. It could also just look like messy data, like they're not taking the test seriously, and it's easy to dismiss this subsegment because of the nature of the way these tests work.
It's an interesting history, isn't it? So Francis Galton in the 1880s clearly recognized that there were people whose power of visualization was zero, as he put it. You'd have thought that somebody would have followed up on that. There was a lot of research on visual imagery in the 70s, 80s, 90s, but nobody focused on the extremes. And I think you're probably right that it was because people were interested in how imagery worked generally. And if you encountered people who lay at the extremes, you'd probably want to discard their data because that could be confusing. It could confuse the picture.
Yeah.
As you say, the explanation would be unclear, and the data might be considered suspect in some way. And I think it's only recently that there's been a focus on individual differences generally, neurodiversity, if you like, which and that's helped this aphantasia to be rediscovered, so to speak, or the phenomenon that we've called aphantasia to be rediscovered.
Yeah. Adam here asks, if you were given £5 million to spend on research, what would you focus on, and would it actually speed anything up? I'm curious what the bottlenecks are in the current research.
Oh, it would definitely speed things up. There are many areas. So I'm keen to define the subtypes of aphantasia. I don't think aphantasia is one thing. I think it's a feature of experience which can occur in a range of different contexts. And at the moment, we aren't quite clear how those contexts differ. So, for example, is there a group of people with aphantasia who have SDAM, a group who have prosopagnosia, a group with autism? Are those groups quite different or overlapping, or how do they relate? Relatedly, I'd like to explore the genetics of aphantasia, and we're hoping that we may be able to do that with the help of a biobank. It seems that if you have aphantasia, there's a roughly tenfold increase in the likelihood that your brother or sister will, suggesting that there may be a genetic element, but we don't yet know what that is. I'd like to know more about the mental health associations. So are there ways in which aphantasia is protective, as we were discussing, perhaps from PTSD or disorders in which imagery may be functioning in a counterproductive way as an emotional amplifier? Are there other conditions which it may predispose to? So those would be a few of the avenues that I'd like to travel down, and funding is always welcome.
Yeah.
And I should say, difficult to obtain
Yes.
in studying a phenomenon which is fascinating, but isn't an obvious public health problem.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Okay, just a few more here, and we're coming near the end. Kathy asks, when in school learning math, I would get the correct answer, but would do it completely different than normal. My grandson is the same. Is that due to aphantasia? And we also have ADHD. Don't know exactly about Kathy's case, but I do think that we've seen that even though aphantasics have very similar outcomes when dealing with different kinds of problems, sometimes the process that they use can look quite different.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I guess the only way to answer that question specifically would be to work through and discover how you and your grandson solve problems. But certainly, I think aphantasia has an impact on education, which is something that's another area that would deserves further study. People with aphantasia are often frustrated at school because they're asked to do things which they don't think anybody can do. Engage in visualization exercises. People often with aphantasia often say that at school they assumed people were lying or were just using language metaphorically, and they later discover that actually that wasn't the case. I guess the take-home message is that most people with aphantasia do fine at school, so it isn't educationally disabling, I don't think. It's sometimes associated with things which can cause problems, but as you say, Tom, I think people with aphantasia often do things differently, and those differences are interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, I'm gonna wrap it up there, Adam. There's so many questions, and we'll have to have you back at a time in the future for some folks to continue the discussion. Yeah, so I guess I'll just say a big thank you for joining. I think it was a great discussion.
Okay.
Wish you all the luck in the book. And just a quick note to all the viewers watching: if you'd like to continue to support our work and to join more of these type of live events, you can learn more at aphantasia.com. And Adam, we'll see you again next time.
Thank you very much for having me.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye now.